So far, we've talked about why organizations might move to team-based structures and some of the pros and cons of multiple team systems and multiple team memberships. In this recording, I'll talk a little bit about, what are some of the things that leaders need to be taking into consideration to support effectiveness in multiple team systems and when people have multiple team membership. One starting point is that leaders often and organizations often assume tools will solve these problems. So, we've seen this massive proliferation of coordination and collaboration software and tools. And of course, these can be effective. I've been working to apply Trello to some of my staff and some of the different projects that we have to cover that are kind of routinely recurring activities in the department. But these alone are not going to solve the problems that it takes to coordinate information and communication. Careful planning can help with this, and it can be useful to coordinate, but these will not be enough in and of themselves. The sort of technological information solutions are not going to resolve the challenges of multiple team membership. So a couple of things that we know tend to kind of plague multiple teams and people with multiple team membership is that, first of all, individuals suffer what are called representational gaps. It's hard to understand the perspective of others, and when switching across different projects, it's really hard to develop shared and common mental models within a team. And again, some of that comes from the competition for resources, the competition for time, and the competition for attention that happens. But Mark Mortenson's work also has identified kind of a new source of interdependence that happens in multiple team systems. So back when we talked about structure in the first week of class, we talked about interdependence inside of teams and the kind of variation between or difference between sequential, pooled, and reciprocal interdependence. Well, Mark's research on multiple team systems shows that there's now something we can call human capital interdependence. And this is interdependence between teams because they share the same human capital, the same team members. And it's not the same, and it's not connected to task interdependence inside the team. It means that you now rely on other teams. You're dependent on them to determine whether or not you're going to have the human capital necessary to work and complete your project. And so you're pulled and you're dependent on those other teams. So that's that kind of mind share that we talked about in a previous recording, where individuals, 80 to 90% of people, managers in organizations, work on more than one team. And the idea that they tend to feel like there's a core team that they give about 50% of their energy to, and then they have these secondary teams that they might give 20% or less to. Well, if you are leading a team and you have a member who is thinking of your team as 20% of their effort, but you need more than that, now what's going on in those other teams is going to harm or help your own outcome and productivity. And that's the idea of human capital interdependence across teams that adds another form of uncertainty and challenge to teamwork in multiple team system organizations or team-based organizations. So to understand the implications of this and how we might resolve some of this challenge of people not necessarily understanding the other projects, not necessarily being able to make sense of what the other people in the multiple teams they're working with are thinking of, or what the kind of common perspective is in those teams, and this idea of human capital interdependence. Mark and some of his colleagues have been doing some really interesting research, and this one, a particular study, they did some simulated modeling of 50 million projects. So they had some basic information about projects, and they were able to take information from teams they've studied and do some simulation models to look at, what are some kind of ways that membership and leadership and structure of these multiple team systems are conducted in organizations, what are the impact on kind of the resource utilization of human capital and human resources in the organization, and the variation of that resource utilization and the structure of these teams on the outcomes like timeliness and project completion. And they also looked at things like if there's unexpected shocks or changes in demand across the projects, like what should change in the utilization of those projects. And just, kind of quickly, these are complicated research studies, but kind of one of the basic findings was that if there are shocks, or one project gets pulled offline or something comes up to another one, if staffing is changed and done on the fly to move resources across. So this is the idea again that there might be conflicting demands in given teams. So the organization must have some leadership or function to look across the teams and recognize when there are unexpected changes, unexpected shocks that maybe pressure one team over another. So ultimately they found that if you would adjust on the fly rather than kind of waiting to project check-in points or completion points or deadlines, that you had a significant reduction of late projects. So it just means that teaming on the fly is real, and having some mechanism to understand and reallocate resources across projects as the ebb and flow of demand occurs is going to improve the performance of teams overall. So we have to think about utilizing resources, but flexibility. One thing is sometimes you might want idle time and slack. It allows people to be redeployed to different projects very quickly. So if you can identify where is that slack in teams and move people's attention across teams, that will help overall efficiency in the organization. But again, these are things to think about, I think, just to put in your mind about the complexity of this and whether or not you have those kinds of systems in place to understand the human capital availability across multiple teams to redeploy and move that across the teams. And I would say at this point in time, many of our organizations aren't as sophisticated to have those sorts of systems in place to be able to really utilize the potential benefit of multiple team systems. Some findings that they had that maybe were a little bit less obvious, but I thought really quite interesting, was that individual teams perform better when their members have a lot of overlap with other teams. So if you think about this picture right here in the middle, there's sort of a cluster of teams. And what you might think about is that this probably means that if I'm on multiple teams, in this middle picture, the other teams that I have membership on also share a fair amount of the same people. And what that probably means is that there's, greater similarity in the kinds of problems we're solving. So that shouldn't be so surprising, I guess, that those are going to do better. Because if you think about, I'm on this team here, and the only other team I'm working on is way over here, and there's no connection between these at all, the switching costs for my attention are going to be much, much higher across these teams as they're going to be here, where if I move to my secondary team and 60% of the members are the same, I know them, I know how they work, and probably because there's that much overlap, the kinds of problems we're solving have a high degree of similarity. Those teams perform better, not surprising. But there's a trade-off with the organization. What this means is that I think this is getting closer and closer to a classic organizational structure where these are probably mostly similar functions. And maybe you might even think about this as, kind of inside of the same brand group or same regional group. And there's multiple teams going on, but they're still about the same kinds of problems. So what happens is the more of this kind of overlap where the multiple teams that you're sitting on have a lot of shared membership and shared problems, spaces, kind of task types, the more that happens in the organization, the less benefit the teams are for the organization, because you're getting more and more narrow again. You're getting something that is looking more like an organizational design that's formed around a particular customer, a particular project, a particular product group, a particular brand, for example. So there's a sort of teeter-totter balance, and as leaders of organizations who are thinking about team-based organizations, there's probably some optimal point where you get high internal team productivity and good learning benefits across the organization. And we don't have an answer exactly how you decide to tune that. But we do know it's going to be more challenging for people the greater the degree of difference of the teams that they're sitting on. It's going to be much harder. It's going to be more personally fatiguing. It's going to create harder switching costs. It's going to be harder for them to keep their work focused and moving forward when there's less overlap in the team membership of the multiple teams they're sitting on. So if we think about, where the real benefits sit in these pros and cons, I think multiple team systems, team-based organizations are generally good for organizations. They have a benefit of elevating social capital because there's movement and new ties and network relationships being created by movement of people working across different teams in the organization. Those network ties provide conduits and flows for knowledge. So learning can happen across the organization, and innovations generated in one place can move faster to another place through the individuals sitting across these different teams. But I think for the most part, multiple teaming is quite hard on individuals. It can be exciting and motivating to have changes of projects so that work doesn't feel repetitive, that, in very specialized, narrow focused organizations, you might feel very limited in your career potential and your own kind of personal development. So there are those benefits, but people feel kind of slapped about by different project leaders. They may feel a lot of conflict in how to manage their time. And in a true flat team-based organization, the kind of typical ways to resolve those conflicts by looking up the hierarchy and expecting a person in formal authority to broker your time may not be present. So you have to engage in a lot more of that individual negotiation, conflict resolution, and influence processes across the different projects that you're working on. As the ratio of kind of shared team membership comes higher, right? So the more people on your team who are also sitting on other teams, the more that there's likely to be conflict in your team. And there's this, the whole point of Mark's book in the overcommitted organization is that people feel overcommitted. They just feel pulled in too many directions and creates stress and fatigue. There's sometimes political tension and those power dynamics of who are you trying to please at which particular point in time. So these kinds of organizations can have more politics that need to be resolved, particularly if there's not a strong central vision, superordinate identity, kind of clear set of organizational goals that align the different teams. You can expect much more conflict and political behavior in these kinds of organizations. So I think the conclusion is multi-teaming or team-based organizations, or the idea of teaming, kind of flexible on-the-fly collaboration, is a double-edged sword. So on one hand, on the right side here, it can be a source of resilience for organizations. It allows more fluid and dynamic deployment of resources because there isn't a rigid structure in place. There isn't sort of a sense of silos owning human resources if this is truly a team-based organization. And it allows the organization to reconfigure kind of quickly and on the fly to adjust to shock. So particularly in environments of rapid change, kind of unstable expectations in industries, demand for innovation, these can be really helpful ways to try to design work. On the other hand, these can be a source of vulnerability. There are connections across groups, and so if a problem happens in one, it may ripple across the organization because it may pull people because of human capital interdependence. Other projects may lose attention if some kind of major project shock is happening in one part of the organization. There's a lot more interconnectedness, whereas classic silos, there's buffering between those. And that buffering is exactly why it's hard to move knowledge horizontally and get coordination and collaboration to happen, but it does create buffers inside the organization. So there's this interdependence, this human capital interdependence is a new kind of risk that has to be assessed and mitigated. And there can sometimes be lower entitativity, lower cohesion, and lower coherence of relationships inside teams because people have these multiple loyalties and switching costs going on all the time. So some of the things we know are valuable for internal dynamics can be damaged by this. And in a way, the risks in team-based organizations are more toward the underbounded teams, right? Teams that don't have strong enough boundaries that there's a sense of identification for members. And lacking that sense of identification, people may feel less loyalty toward and less committed toward the work of any given team because of these sort of more open, porous boundaries across the multiple team membership. So, in sum, there are a lot of strong reasons for organizations to push toward more flat team-based structures, more flexible collaborations that are fluid and changing over time, but they introduce a whole bunch of other challenges to create local effectiveness in any given team, and overall organizational challenges in sort of managing the application of human capital and human resources across different teams and projects.